Well, it looks like it's 7 o'clock, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Um, I'd like to thank council for taking the time tonight to meet with us in this work session. So we're going to discuss the last three chapters that need to be drafted in the code, which is signs, lighting, and then the administrative process. So before I turn it over to Liz and she walks us through our presentation and guides the discussion tonight, I just wanted to touch on the email I sent last week with the draft chapters for the previous chapters that we have talked about. I sent that really not expecting everyone to review it for this meeting, but just for council to have a chance to start to read through it and spend some time with it. What we're planning to do is touch on the last chapters tonight, work on drafting those last remaining three chapters. Then we have a public open house that Liz will touch on a little bit. That's scheduled for the end of June. That will start to review a lot of the material in those original 5 chapters with the public. And then after that meeting, I think we'll be at the point where we'll circle back and kind of touch on everything and kind of go through it again. So I think we have at least the month of June for council to have a chance to read through those 5 chapters and have probably a chance to get a good look at the topics we'll be talking about tonight. So I just wanted to make that clear from a timing perspective. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Liz and she'll walk us through our topics for tonight.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy. And sorry for the folks that have to see this a second time. So like Jeremy said, we have finished the drafting of the districts and uses, the dimensional design standards, parking and landscaping, and fencing. And so those are the ones that you have in front of you, or that he sent last week to review. We are currently drafting signage and lighting and administration. We'll have to wrap up after that with the rest of the definitions that we've drafted the definitions that were use definitions. We still need to kind of wrap up the rest of the definitions and then do kind of like that first chapter, your general provisions. So those are just kind of the minor things that then we'll have to wrap up at the end, but we should be on track to kind of have all that done by August and then be set to kind of have it ready for approval in the fall. So this is just kind of a reminder of where we've been. I know you saw this graphic the last time. And then I just wanted to highlight that public open house that's scheduled for June 23rd. And so that'll be exciting to share the chapters that have been drafted with the public and get some feedback from them as we continue on the process. So to kind of summarize what we've been doing since our last meeting, we did kind of finish up the drafts of parking and landscaping. Those chapters were reviewed by staff and those comments were incorporated into the drafts that you all received. We have also been discussing with legal the options for what we can do with the separation of uses. When we met last time, we discussed the possibility of right now we're proposing a 3,000-foot separation between small format stores and vape stores and those kind of uses, and maybe seeing if we could increase that or kind of what our abilities are around that distance separation. So we're still doing some research on that, having conversations. And so hopefully we'll have some more information on that in the future and have some more direction from legal on, you know, what they're comfortable with us proceeding with from a legal standpoint. And then we already kind of talked about the chapters that are ready for review. And then again, we'll be finishing up the chapters we are talking about tonight in the next month or so. And then those will be available to review. So we're going to start with signage. This is a tricky topic and Kevin Butler was going to be on the call to kind of give the legal background on this. I know he sent a very lengthy email to you all. So that should provide some kind of background on the kind of the recent legal decisions around signs and where we've been and where we're going. So at this point, I'm kind of waiting on Kevin to give us more direction on what we can do from a content neutral versus content based regulations and the commercial versus non-commercial speech. So Kevin is going to take the first shot at kind of updating the code from that standpoint. And then I'll help kind of finish up the design standards and the size allowances and that kind of thing that I know we want to look at with this code update. So the decisions that we need some direction on tonight is more the kind of the types of signs you want to see, the design styles, all that kind of thing that, you know, are not a content versus not content versus not content, more of just kind of what kinds of signs you want to see within the city. So the first thing is wall signs. There's a couple different styles of wall signs. The more kind of typical one that people recognize is this cabinet versus channel letter signs. And we wanted just to kind of throw this out there as to see if there was any concern with the city about only allowing certain types of wall signs. Like I know some communities require signs to be these channel letter cut signs, and they don't allow the kind of traditional cabinet signs anymore. Or if you just kind of care, we got some feedback from the advisory committee that the size and scale of a wall sign is more important than the type of wall sign it is. So if anybody has any additional thoughts on kind of wall signs, happy to talk about it. All right. Well, if anything else comes up, we'll just continue on that path of looking at the size of wall signs, going from there. So monument signs or freestanding signs come in many different shapes and sizes. And so we're going to touch on kind of options for single tenant signs and then multi-tenant signs and then electronic signs. So these single tenant signs, there's kind of a variety of typical monument signs. The kind of the bottom three and then this dogs all day are very typical monument signs. This dogs all day is on the stone base. These others are kind of more modern mix of materials, things like that, but all fairly low profile. Some are in landscape beds, some are not. The one that's kind of and something else to consider is this cask and pig sign. That is what we call a pylon sign, where it's not a traditional pole sign. It's typically kind of smaller than a pole sign, but does have these kind of two legs that it stands on. And it kind of does rise it up from the street. I just wanted to see if there was kind of the appetite to allow those kind of signs, or if you wanted to keep kind of single tenant signs, these lower profile, typical monument signs. Any thoughts on that?
I have a question.
Sure.
So can we say that we only want monument signs? And if so, how would multi-tenant entities, you know, I mean, clearly that wouldn't work with, you know, like the shopping plazas.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about multi-tenant signs next. So
Okay.
Typically with sign codes, we put in some sort of stipulation that if you're a shopping center or a multi-tenant office complex at a certain size, you know, we put out, you know, basically kind of a threshold that if you hit that threshold, then that would qualify for a bigger multi-tenant sign. That's kind of the typical way things, you know, places do the monument versus the multi-tenant. And so if you're just, you know, if you have one use on a lot, you get a monument sign like these lower profile ones, and you establish a maximum height and size. Some communities require certain types of materials or certain bases of certain types of materials. And then again, if you hit that threshold, then that may qualify you for bigger multi-tenant signs to allow the kind of multi-use advertisement. In our last advisory committee discussion, though, we got some kind of pushback on those multi-tenant signs. So we'll talk about that more on the next slide.
Okay. I mean, I don't know how others feel, but my personal opinion is
Oh, we lost her.
Kathy, you're muted.
Yeah, she muted. Kathy, you muted.
sorry. I don't know how others feel, but I personally prefer the monument signs for the single tenants. We have so many of the really tall signs that we're trying to get away from. I just think it's a much cleaner look.
I'll add too, I like the idea of having landscaping around monument signs.
And that's pretty
I'll
typical.
agree. I prefer the monument signs as well.
So low profile monument with landscaping.
And Liz, you mentioned, and I sometimes need time to process at the
fine.
last meeting about materials. And it made me think, like, a lot of times new businesses, and not all of them, but will go with like the least expensive that they can. And it isn't necessarily going to last or wear well. So I do think it would be nice to have some sort of stipulation. I mean, I hate to say everybody has to have some sort of stone. But, I know new businesses that they may very well put the least amount of money into it that they can at the time. So I think having a standard would be a good thing.
I know one thing that businesses tend to do if they're trying to be on the cheap is they just kind of get like a plywood thing and paint it and put it on some sticks. And so if you didn't allow kind of that pylon sign, that would take that kind of sign out of contention, which is probably a good thing. So, I mean, I don't know if you need to go to the extent of requiring a brick or stone base, but we could put some language in about, materials that are weather rated or something like that, higher quality materials that can kind of maintain through several seasons of weather. Because you guys are in a harsh climate and, you want materials to be able to last and not look, old and rusty or crappy after like 6 months.
Hey, Liz, could you also just kind of do the flip on it or reverse it and say, these materials cannot be used for a sign, like you said, plywood or whatever, and just kind of eliminate some of the low grade temporary type things?
Yes, of course you can do that.
Okay.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. My one comment about elimination is that I think it creates some level of ambiguity, because if you're not comprehensive about what you're eliminating, and your code doesn't speak to something, I think it creates some confusion in some sense. So I think we just have to be careful. It's difficult to be, to think of every little thing in that scenario.
Yes. Yeah, it is. But I think we can set up some parameters that are easy for staff to enforce and get you the look and feel that you want. All right, now on to the multi-tenant signs. So these could be controversial. Like I said, generally there would be a threshold of size of center or number of buildings or, that kind of thing to allow one of these signs. You can see that most of these are commercial centers, but the bottom middle one looks like it's more of kind of like an office park or something like that. And so just kind of wanted to see if there was certain types of multi-tenant signs that you are, comfortable with versus other ones that you aren't comfortable with. And so I can make sure that those regulations are we either don't allow these or only allow these in certain circumstances and in certain ways. Thoughts on this?
So I guess one thought I have is that if we are going to allow those pylon signs, the example that you have here for the multi-tenant one is clearly very high quality with the stone base.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we want to limit the height. I mean, the others look great too. I don't know how others feel, but I just want to make sure if we do go forward with allowing pylon signs, that we ensure that it has to be, very high quality materials that are aesthetically pleasing as well.
Any other thoughts?
I personally feel as though that pylon that Kathy's talking about, I'm not a big fan of it. And I know that it has like 20 different names on it at the moment, and
Okay.
that wouldn't be our case. I'm just not a big fan of it.
Are you all more comfortable with these kind of smaller scale one, like this Wesleyan Plaza and the Village Square, where they're maybe 10 feet in height or 12 feet in height versus this Mountain Gate one, which is like probably 25 feet tall or something ridiculous,
I just got a comment. The
Sure.
bottom left one. The problem with that is when you put 20 different people on there, or tenants on there, or companies or whatever, you just can't read it. I mean, and then you're going to restrict them in height. So you're going to cram it down to smaller letters. When you go down the street, you can't read all that. And, I drive for a living and I have to find stuff. And I'll tell you what, that it looks like a bunch of just scribble when you're driving fast, because you cannot read that. You restrict the height, it gets worse. So the one all the way to the right, the bottom right is okay. The one upper right is okay. So I don't know what you're going to do, but you cram them in like that. I seen them worse than that. You got about what, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, but maybe 15. I've seen them with 30 on there. How are you going to read that when you're going by? That's impossible.
Yeah, one
So-
thing you could do is establish a minimum set letter height so that they couldn't have letter heights at 6 inches tall on a sign that's 20 feet in the air. So that's an option. You could also limit the number of tenants that are on a sign. So they're, if you want to allow these signs in certain circumstances, we could definitely come up with some regulations that restrict the size, but also make sure that they're readable and kind of safe for people to review as they walk or drive by.
Because it becomes one big blur. The one in Ridge Park Square is nice. I mean, they got tenants on it, but you can read it. And there's not that many. But when like I said, we got to do something with it, because you can't have that many on there. You're causing people to stare at it harder instead of the road, trying to figure out what's in that plaza. A lot of times people don't even look at that because it's just too much. It's too busy. So I don't know if you want to put more than one, or like Kathy was saying, restrict the height. Well, if you restrict the height and you add a lot of tenants on there, stores, what have you, and you cram it down smaller, then when you let them go high. But then again, if you let them go too high, then you're going to be looking up in the air. So I don't know. That's got to be looked at. Something's got to be done with it, because it can't stay the way it is.
No, that's all helpful and gives me some direction to work around. All right, the next topic is electronic signs. I know these can be controversial, but they're also more, mainstream than they once were. But we see electronic signs for many different reasons and purposes. And so that's something to think about, of where, when, how, who gets an electronic sign, or if no one does. Here we have a couple examples of public and institutional uses. There's 2 schools and a church. And then, you have gas stations that can have various sizes and locations of electronic pricing, which is, something that nowadays gas stations require to have that electronic pricing. And then you have that lovely Las Vegas sign that looks like a TV screen and is the more ridiculous end of things. But I did want to check in to see if there's preferences on, who, what, where, what kind of signs, if it's full video or to color, what kinds of uses, that kind of thing, to kind of help define what kind of electronic signs are okay, since you don't regulate them at all at the moment. Any thoughts?
So what is the latest thinking on electronic signs and how are businesses using them? I mean, right now, we had one in the city, but it's been non-operational for many years. I know the schools have one. I think there's a church that has one, and of course the gas stations. But how are businesses using electronic signs?
So they're definitely more common now than they used to be. I would say it's very common for more fast food restaurants and that kind of stuff to have a, electronic sign of some sort. Sometimes they're just these 2-color messages where, it'll just say deal on tacos or whatever it is. But I know some McDonald's and things will have kind of full picture videos when they have a new product and things like that. So, restaurants want them. I know it's more common for like business parks and things like that than it once was. It also is an opportunity to cut down on those multi-tenant signs we were just talking about. If you can replace a bunch of, little signs on a multi-tenant sign with an electronic sign that kind of flips through the different businesses that are in an area, you can have a lot more smaller size. The new electronic signs are really easy to control. You can control them on a website or on your phone, on an app. You can change the brightness. They automatically will dim in the evenings, versus during the day. You can set them on timers for any amount of change that you want. So it is something that I think people want more and expect more, but I know a lot of communities still are restricting them heavily. So I think you're going to be, kind of wherever Brooklyn wants to land, you're probably not going to be more restrictive or more lenient than, other people. It's just kind of, we need to find sort of the middle ground that makes you guys comfortable.
So one thing we're going to have to be cautious of is what you mentioned about the brightness, because, for example, Ridge Park Square, Bidoff Plaza, those are, 2 main shopping areas that are also surrounded by residential. And that's something I think we really need to keep in the back of our minds when we develop this. I know, I still occasionally get complaints about the electronic billboard that's on 480 that, even though they apparently are following the regulations for brightness, it's still, shining in people's homes late at night. So we need to keep that in the back of our minds as we develop this.
I think too, I know you talked a little bit about like fonts and colors. I think the least distracting we can make them, the best. Just, if we stick with one single color or that type of a thing, I think that's smart.
Yeah, that's very common that people, are okay with just a single color. The other thing to consider is I know some communities make all electronic signs conditional uses. And so it allows them to have a little bit of extra review, notification of neighbors, things like that. But I don't know if that's something that's appealing to you, or if you would just, want to have them permitted with standards in certain circumstances, in certain zones, or on certain frontages or things like that. So the approval process also is something we'll need to consider.
I would say that in addition to developing the regulations, that I think it would be advisable to make them conditional use, just because we do have, some circumstances where we have large businesses that are, surrounded by residents. So that way we could, take a look on it as a case-by-case basis.
I agree.
Especially, Liz, if we are moving away from Planning Commission having to approve all signs, I think this would be a good case that Planning Commission did still approve them, even if we didn't call it conditional use.
Yeah, we could just say that, they require a public hearing at planning commission. And, that's it, or something like that. Like we could, again, kind of figure out what that best process is. But I agree that reviewing these on a case by case basis is a kind of a good compromise, because some of them are going to make a lot of sense and some of them are going to be silly, and it'll give you that opportunity to look at the adjacent properties and what's around it and the context and the size and all that kind of thing, and make decisions based on that.
Well, and just talking about the colors, I mean, when we're looking at the gas station signs, if those were all one, I mean, the prices are single colors, and to me, that's single color. But if they were all red, you would have a much more difficult time reading it than if they're the red, orange, green like they are now, or especially the side by side. I mean, if that was all red or all green, you wouldn't really know where one began or one ended. So I think like those are the things where you have to discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by making them a conditional use, that ensures a couple things. First of all, that it must go to the planning commission, like Sue mentioned, but also that residents in the area would be notified and have the opportunity to weigh in.
Yep. Nope. That all makes perfect sense. All right. That's all I have for you on signage. Is there anything else that anybody wants to talk about with signs?
Just a question. So the plan is to move away from planning commission approval for signs?
So we talked about that at the advisory committee. And so at the end of this presentation, we're going to discuss a little bit about kind of the administration procedures. But one of the things I brought up was that it's fairly rare that planning commission is the approval body for all signs. A lot of communities look at it that if a sign meets the size requirements and all the zoning requirements in the code, then that can be a staff approval. And only if a sign can't meet code would it then be a variance at the Board of Zoning Appeals, or, with electronic signs, it could be a conditional use, that kind of thing. I would say that's more typical and can be kind of more user-friendly for businesses to not throw them through an extra process. But again, it is something that's up to you all of where you want to plan with it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, lighting I want to touch on real quick. Typically in zoning codes, we address lighting from this standpoint pretty simply. This is kind of what we've done for a long time, is basically saying that you can't have these non-cutoff lights, these globe lights that just let light go anywhere, that we want to see cutoff fixtures that point light down and away from a property line and away from residential. And so this kind of direction is very common. But what it doesn't address these days is kind of all the new nuances of LED lighting and the complications that come around with that. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the, LED and more modern lighting situations to just kind of get a feel on if there's certain things that you want to make sure that you don't allow, or that we write in there very specifically when it comes to lighting. We will be looking at kind of standards to make sure that the lights aren't too bright still, and that they're, that they're not shining at residential, but there are some kind of weird nuances, things that, are worth kind of thinking about how you want to address. So thoughts on lighting?
Hey, Liz,
Mhm.
are you using anything from California, any of the California dark sky resolutions, laws, or whatever?
Yeah, California and like Arizona and stuff like that have very strict dark sky regulations. We can look at those. Typically, like that's probably stricter than you want to go, but it maybe not. I mean, that's something that's up to you. That is a good kind of best practice research from the kind of the stricter end of things. Is that something that you would like us to look at and get kind of a sense on what the best practices are that there are?
It's a possibility. It's not a bad idea. I mean, we're going through also with the city with getting all the street lighting done. So we've had an outside firm kind of design, so we're not having light pollution go into people's homes, et cetera. So we're kind of like already one step there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it'd probably be good for us to run whatever new lighting regulations we come up with through that process, you know, kind of compare it to those lights just to make sure that we're not conflicting what you all are putting into the city. You know, we want to make sure that that's consistent. But
Okay.
yeah, we can look at the bright sky. I know I was just looking at lighting chapters for another community code that I'm working on. And with the LED and the lumens and all of that, there are some very complicated lighting codes out there now where there's like tables and tables and tables of, if you're in this situation, this is your lighting requirement. But if you're in this situation, this is your lighting requirement. And I'm not sure we need to get into that level of specificity where you have like a 20-page lighting code. But we also want to make sure that you're not, you know, that you're taking care of your residents and the safety aspects of lighting as well.
One other thing, I know we talked briefly about like, you know, a lot of places, and I know, like Andy said, the city is talking about switching ours to LED, but making sure there's like, if there's a way like that, if LED lights are being used, it's not too overpowerful because it is a lot more efficient. Because I know even going through the whole process with the city, we talked about even reducing it, I believe, more than what the standard was on a lot of streets, and that it is sufficient lighting for safety, safety reasons as well.
With, sorry, Liz, with the company that we're dealing with, they've done numerous cities on the East Coast and in Canada. So they're using like national regulations, et cetera. So they've already got pretty much a template set up as to what wattages they need for residential streets compared to main streets, compared to intersections, et cetera.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it might be helpful to see that if that's something that you guys have copies of, just to make sure
Okay.
you kind of understand that. But generally the zoning code is going to regulate lighting on private properties, not in your right of way. But again, if you're, you know, capping lumens at whatever, it's like, I think 3000 Kelvin light heatness. This is not my area of expertise, but you know, if you're capping it at 3000 and then we put a maximum of 4000 in the code, you know, like that's something we need to think through and make sure that we're understanding, or vice versa, where if we cap it at 3000, you're at 4000, that kind of thing. I think it'd be good to just kind of see how those are consistent, or if they are or not. Any other thoughts on lighting? All right. It's normally a very simple chapter. It's getting really complicated with these silly LED lights, which I know are very helpful, but it's making my life harder. All right, wrapping up administration procedures and processes. This chapter is not going to change drastically from your existing regulations, but I am reorganizing everything. It's going to be a lot easier to follow and to understand. And so that's where the focus is going to be for this chapter. But we also are looking at your processes to see if we need to streamline anything or change, like we talked about, the sign approvals, things like that, where there's opportunities to kind of make some changes since we're in there and rewriting this section. So one thing I wanted to kind of show you, we are creating these flowcharts for the code that will highlight kind of processes and from a higher level kind of show applicants and the public what your process is for each different application type. So we'll have this for zoning map amendments, conditional uses, site plan approvals, building permits, kind of the whole 9 yards. So these will be incorporated into the code and will be supplemented by kind of the full instructions of the approval process. So this is a supplement to that and not to be like out of like the full process, but to be sort of an easier reminder to the public of what process you go through. And then we'll also be incorporating a summary table of your procedures. And so this is just an example of that table that's going to be in the code, but we'll have your procedures on one side. They're running up the vertical end here, and then your different boards and commission bodies along the top, including staff and the Court of Common Pleas. And it identifies who kind of reviews, who makes a decision, if a public hearing is necessary, if it's a recommendation, who the appeal body is, all of that. And so this is going to be a really easy thing for both the public and your staff and applicants to kind of just very easily see what that process is. And this will be supplement obviously by those flow charts. So there was a couple things that stood out to me that I wanted to discuss. One being your current conditional use process. This is different than what I am used to generally. Right. Okay. Right now, your conditional use process is that there's a public hearing and a decision by planning commission, and then it goes to city council for confirmation. Most of the communities, I think probably all but City of Brooklyn, the conditional use process is a one-step thing in either a decision by the Board of Zoning Appeals or the Planning Commission. That has been pretty, I'm not sure. I think Planning Commission is typically more the approval body than Board of Zoning Appeals, but I've seen both ways commonly. So I did want to just see if you all like this two-step process of Planning Commission to City Council, or if you would be open to reducing that to a one-stop process with either Planning Commission or your Board of Zoning Appeals. So any thoughts on that?
So two things. One is actually a question, and that's, is there a downside to it other than, there could be, they might have to wait a week longer or something like that. I think in our community, historically, we recognize that, conditional use does require a higher level of, examination. And, I think that's why it does go to council. That I think it just kind of emphasizes that, it just deserves a higher level of scrutiny. And then other than, there could be a little bit of a delay, we do meet twice a month, and we certainly are always open to special meetings if there would be something that would have to be addressed. Is there any other downside to continuing with council confirming a conditional use?
Liz, can I mention what we talked about in our first meeting? Kathy, one of the things that we mentioned is that at Planning Commission, we get all of the Planning Commission, I'm just saying we because I'm on it today. The Planning Commission gets the whole presentation, gets all the paperwork that's involved with it. But when it goes to council, none of that is there because it's just more or less a confirmation. So that council ends up making a decision, confirming and not confirming based on just their own research or background, because it's not coming to city council as a presentation and not all of the information is there. So that was what we talked about. So it's not just the time, it's the actual information that city council has.
And I would add to that a little bit because I was at the last meeting. It's that back and forth ability to question the applicant, I think is what's missing. I think of it in a manner of due process, and because there's not this back and forth with the applicant to clear up any confusion or issues that may arise, that's what my big hiccup is. I think if this process were to stay in place and council would like to confirm it, I think the way it's set up right now does not make sense.
So I can say that I've never been in a position where I voted on a conditional use and I didn't have the information. Depending on what the situation was, I either attended the Planning Commission meeting, which is what I do the vast majority of the time. Certainly there's been some, like a few that were pretty minor. And if I needed information, I contacted the building commissioner and got my questions addressed that way. I understand what the mayor's saying about there isn't a back and forth. I know when Bethany Lutheran came for conditional use for Copperstone, they were prepared. We did ask questions at that meeting. So I think that if we decide to keep this, I think that's a good point. And I think we just provide the opportunity in the agenda to see if any members of council have any questions, or, certainly it's always helpful when they bring, either the plans or the conceptual drawings. And the other thing too is, when we know that it's going to be on our agenda, I think that's also like an indication to all of us to, if you have any questions, either attend the meeting, talk to Sue, who's our representative on the planning commission, or contact the building commissioner.
No, I think those are all good comments. Is there any other thoughts on that?
I would say one more thing. I mean, since we're talking about this, I've seen in the past that, there's the legal issue of a recommendation by the administration. And in some cases, we've gotten to the confirmation and we've had city council say no. And the reason why the planning commission had said yes is because after reviewing the zoning code as it's written and going through the factors of conditional use available to us legally, we shouldn't have said no. And in some respects, because of that missing gap of not information, but the lack of looking for that information, I think sometimes we just need to be careful, because it puts the city in a precarious situation if council is not looking at those conditional use steps and taking that in consideration rather than what they would like to see somewhere, because that's their ideal use versus what's in our code. So again, I think maybe this administration should do an educational piece if this remains in here about those conditional use factors.
I agree with that. Your suggestion about doing an education piece. We've talked about this actually in the past also, even for planning commission members and board of zoning members, because, for example, in granting a conditional use, the criteria is right there in the code that, and if they don't meet that, then they should not be granting conditional use. And I agree 100% that it doesn't come down to just what your ideal is or what you think it should be.
Kevin Butler did a really nice presentation this year going over that with both the Board of Zoning Appeals and Planning Commission. And I think that, as new council people come on, I think that would be beneficial to include them as well.
All right, are we good? Okay. So that sounds, we'll kind of continue to think about this and we'll propose something, and then we can kind of continue to go back and forth on this and see what makes sense as we proceed. The other thing that we already kind of mentioned is with the role of planning commission approval. Right now, planning commission has to review all the signs. That is something that would be a fairly easy thing to make a staff review and approval, and would lessen kind of planning commission's agenda and also remove a step from the applicant. But there are other you know, a lot of communities allow for staff to do other kind of small reviews that if, you know, if a small addition or small something, small parking lot addition meets the zoning code and they're doing everything that they're supposed to do, then that can be approved by staff instead of being approved by planning commission. That's also something you could consider incorporating in the update, but you can also leave everything how it is, and that's your purview as well. Any thoughts there?
I guess as far as the site plan you're referring to, my personal opinion is I think it belongs at the Planning Commission. I'm fine with the signs, especially because we're going to, you know, be updating our code for the signs. So I have no problem if it conforms to the code that, you know, our building commissioner approves that.
And that was also the direction that the advisory committee recommended. So that's, you know, in line with that conversation. So I think we can go in that direction. And then once you see the full administration section and the sign section, and if there's anything else that we want to tweak in there, we'll have that opportunity too. So wrap up, any other thoughts or anything about your processes, your procedures, anything else that you want to highlight or make sure that, you know, we address with the update? All right. If anything else does come up, just let us know, you know, send along those comments to Jeremy and we'll make sure they're addressed. So just to kind of wrap up with our next steps, we're going to finish the drafting of those signage and lighting chapters and the administration chapters. And then we have that public review at the end of public meeting at the end of the month to review the 5 chapters that were sent to you previously. Those will be available on the public website soon. And we'll kind of address those chapters at that time. And then we'll come back to the public in a few months with kind of the rest of the chapters once staff and you all have had a chance to review that as well. So that's all I have. But if there's any other questions.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Do we have a time for the public meeting yet?
Yes, it's at 6:30 on June 23rd.
Thank you.
It'll be at the senior center again.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, that's all we had for tonight. And I think we really appreciate the feedback and the conversation. It gives us some good direction moving forward. And Liz will start moving on those chapters and we'll review those internally. And we look forward to sharing a draft with you all in the near future. And appreciate your time tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.